Hello everyone, and welcome to Weekend Workshops, presented by the Wichita Falls Museum of Art at MSU Texas. In the tradition of makerspaces, we are here to learn the basics of a new medium and make it your own. Today, we are going to be focused on acrylic paints. So, acrylic paint, what separates acrylic paint from other forms like oil or watercolor, much like the separation between any kind of paint, is really what are the particles of color called pigments suspended in. In oil paint, they're suspended in oil. In watercolor, they're suspended in water with a little bit of gum arabic. But with acrylic paints, you're looking at pigment that's suspended in a polymer acrylic. So what that means is once this paint dries, you are effectively left with a layer of plastic that is full of color from all of the pigment that's inside of it. Acrylic paint was originally developed in the 1930s and 1940s as a fast-drying alternative to other paints that were primarily being used, usually oil paints. Once it was developed, it quickly took off in manufacturing, in use in the home, and in creating art. So let's talk about how to actually work with it. So the reasons why you would actually pick acrylic paint over other kinds of paint, like we talked about earlier, it is very, very fast drying. This can be really convenient. It can be very immediate as far as an art making material goes, and you don't have to wait a long, long time for that paint to dry. Now, when it comes to selecting your paint, you'll find that there are a lot of different kinds of acrylic paint out there, and usually the distinction between the types are the grades that they're sold in. So today I have a student grade paint and an artist grade paint. These two containers cost exactly the same, give or take a couple of cents. But this one is about 16 times cheaper than the artist grade. So what are the differences between the two? Well, generally, when we look at the differences between artist grade paints and student grade paints, we're looking at the pigment count. We're looking at how dense is that pigment count within the paint, meaning there's actually more particles of color in a smaller amount with the artist paint compared to the student paint. Generally, I have also found that artist grade paints are a little thicker unless you're buying fluid acrylic paints compared to the comparable student grade paint. Outside of the pigment count, we're also looking at a wider range of colors. You can find all sorts of colors with artist grade. Usually you'll have a little bit more limited of a palette when it comes to student grade paints, although once you know how to mix color, you can make whatever color you need. We're also using artist grade paints because of the light fastness of it. And what that means is over time, these paints will fade to some degree. But artist grade paints will generally hold on to their color and brightness a lot easier than student grade paints will. Just from looking at our sample here of paint that was taken directly from the tube and from the bottle and then applied to paper, you can even see there's a difference in the intensity and color as well. Okay, so outside of using acrylics because they're fast drying, they're also very vivid. It's very easy to get very opaque layers of paint put down on your paper or canvas with using acrylic compared to something like watercolor. But that's not to say that acrylic can't be worked like other paints. That's part of the flexibility of working with it. But we'll get to that in a little bit. So looking at the tools in front of us, we have some brushes. They're going to be used to apply paint onto the paper. I have a range of different shapes. I have a flat brush, I have a chisel tip brush, and I have a round brush. There are even more types of brushes out there, but these are the ones I generally like to use. And when it comes to acrylic, I like using something like a chisel point brush because you have a wide surface if you need wider lines. You have a finer tip that you can use if you need, finer lines. You just don't apply quite as much pressure. And you also have the additional element of a line of this width just by turning your brush in different directions as you use it. Other brushes have their uses, but generally chisel tip brushes and filbert brushes are probably the most flexible from what I've found. I also have a palette knife. And the reason why I have a palette knife is because when it comes to actually mixing your paint, whether it's mixing different colors together, mixing different media types into your paint, if you use a brush to mix your color, the paint that you are trying to mix will absorb up into these bristles. And if you don't get that color exactly right on the first try, this can translate into a lot of wasted paint, and that we don't want to waste materials when we're working with this, especially once you start working with artist grade materials. It can also be used to apply paint, especially if you are mixing up a batch that is a little bit thicker than usual. Okay, so when it comes to applying paint to the surface of paper, you could just go directly in using a brush and apply it to the surface. And this goes for both artist grade and student grade paints. Even here you can see the difference in artist grade paint versus student grade paint. You're welcome to use either, but if you are trying to make work that will last longer and maintain its brilliance, you'll probably want to eventually start using the higher quality materials. Now, because acrylic is so easy to dive into, because you can just apply it directly to paper, I wanted to talk about mixing mediums a little bit more in depth, because they can really open up the possibilities of what you can do with acrylic paint. So if we go back to my sample, we'll see that we have a row that's dedicated to directly out of the container that the paint is purchased in. We have a matte version of the paint, and you can kind of see that the way our light doesn't reflect off it quite as much as the gloss. We have a section for modeling. If you can tell by the video, it has a three-dimensional quality to it. It has peaks and valleys, and when worked with in this way, you can imitate oil paintings, very thick impasto style oil paintings. And you also have the ability to add pearlescent pigments. These are only a few different additives that you can add to acrylic. You can also add pouring mediums in order to make it more fluid. You can add, you can add in chemicals that will slow the drying time of acrylic so that you have a little bit more time to work with them. But in order to achieve these different effects, you're going to want to use mixing mediums. So this is matte medium. You mix this into your paint in order to reduce the amount of gloss that you might experience once that paint is dry. We have gloss medium if you wanted to give even more shine to the paint that you're working with. Modeling paste will allow you to have that three-dimensional impasto type effect. There are pearlescent mixing mediums as well as pigment that you can add directly to your paint. And pouring mediums, which will thin them down. Now you might want to ask yourself, why would I use these different mediums? Well, when you're using these more expensive artist paints, in order to, one, change the quality of what that paint looks like when it's actually on the paper, you will absolutely turn to one of these mediums. But by using these mediums, which are often much more affordable compared to the paint itself, you can stretch the life of your paint. You can increase how long you can actually use it because you are able to dilute it effectively, but you're able to do it in a way that's stable and will allow it to maintain a hold onto whatever surface you're painting it on. The other reason why you might want to use more expensive acrylic paints is because when you apply paint that is wet onto the surface of paper or canvas, more often than not, you're going to experience that the paint that is wet is going to be brighter than the paint that is dry. And that is because the binding agent that these pigments are mixed into, that polyacrylic, is often a white color, okay? And as that paint dries, that white will disappear and turn into just a clear layer. But because you're losing the brightness of the white mixing medium or the actual polymer itself that the pigment is mixed into, you're going to lose some brightness. But by using higher quality artist paints, you don't experience that effect quite as much, and it's a little bit more controllable. So one last thing I wanted to mention. This is our artist grade paint, this is our student grade paint, and then these are just puddles of matte mixing medium. I wanted to talk about mixing paint into paint or mixing paint into medium. And earlier, like I said, we're going to be using a palette knife in order to do this. Whenever you are mixing colors together, you always want to start with a tiny amount of the darker color and then mix it into the lighter color. This is because darker colors can very quickly overpower your lighter colors, and it's very easy to accidentally overdo it, and then you'll have to start all over again. This won't be quite as dramatic because we're mixing in basically a white to clear mixing medium. It's not as dramatic of an effect as if you were mixing, say, blue into yellow, but it will still illustrate the same idea. So we are going to take just a little bit, just a tiny amount, and I'm going to show you how much it can actually influence a larger pool of a lighter color. See that? Very, very quickly to overtake it. Now, mixing mediums in this way can also give you lighter tones that you can work with, which can be helpful as well. And then if you wanted this to be darker, just take a little bit more and add it in. And you can keep doing this until you are left with a matte version of the paint that you're working with in whatever tone that you might need. Okay, so you may be wondering, why am I using a shallow plastic container with some damp paper towel and a baking sheet over top of it as a palette? Because acrylic paint is as fast drying as it is, one method that you can use in order to slow down that drying or even preserve small amounts of paint for a couple of days is to create what's called a wet palette. You can buy wet palettes, and they do an effective job. But I found that the homemade version of the wet palette works really well, and it's very affordable, very cheap to make. But once you start mixing these colors, you're going to be left with very thin areas of paint, and that paint will dry very quickly. So by having a moist layer underneath a surface that will allow a little bit of that moisture to come through, will allow these paints to stay hydrated for longer. I realized that I didn't do too much painting in this video. And that's because acrylic paint honestly is very direct. You can take it straight from the container, you can mix in different mediums to work with it, you can mix whatever color you want. If you are getting into using acrylic paint, there are lists online, and I will probably put in a list in the About section of this video, of 7 to 10 colors that will give you all of the colors that you need in order to mix just about anything that you might use. So I apologize for not painting too much in this video, because like I said, it really is a very direct process. It's very immediate. You put it right down on the surface that you're trying to paint. Paint in thin layers that will help maintain a smooth layer, and it will allow a nice even coat of broad areas of color to be placed down. But I wanted to take this video to more explore the mixing mediums that we are working with. And I wanted to use this as an opportunity to really encourage you to explore higher quality art making mediums once you find out what kind of art making you love to do. Because while it is absolutely possible to create a finished work of art using more affordable budget supplies, by using supplies that are higher quality, generally it's easier to get better results. And because it's easier, it's going to aid in your art making process rather than giving you unintended frustrations. Okay? So with that, I wanted to wish you a good day. Thank you for watching this video. We appreciate it, and I will see you next time.